all week.
Yeah, well, starting
Good morning.
good morning, starting Tuesday at least. So as much as we'd like to be outside, we have to continue with our journey together. So I just put into the chat the next visual research exercise, or VRE. It's the exhibition at the Met Museum, and it's called Pictures Revisited. Now, pictures, it's interesting because like a couple of days ago, the gallery that hosted pictures initially in, I think the early 80s, yeah, that's likely, has announced that they're closing after 40 years of being in business. So I think it's sort of timely that Metro Pictures, the gallery that hosted the show, is exiting from the gallery world, and we can sort of reconsider that show, which really made that gallery's reputation and started a whole new sort of way of thinking about art in the 80s, at least through the 90s and the aughts, and probably still. So it's not they didn't recreate the original exhibition exactly. They've added a number of contemporary artists that were not included in the show. To sort of reflect perhaps how those, how the pictures exhibition sort of influenced artists for many, many years afterwards. So it's, it's something we haven't talked about, of course, because that happened in the 80s. It was really the beginning of something we call postmodernism in visual art, well, in art in general, because it also happened in other areas like architecture, music, etc. But just really briefly, and I don't want to go too deeply into it because we're going to talk about it at another time, but just to give it a little bit of context, what was going on in the mid 20th century, beginning in the 19 teens and certainly up until the 1960s, abstraction had been dominant. We'd gone through a number of so-called isms in visual art, and abstract expressionism in particular was kind of dominant in the painting scene. There was minimalism, where really it's in some cases it would be a blank canvas or very minimal drawing on the paper or canvas. And then we sort of got into something called conceptualism into the 70s. Really interesting stuff, but actually when you walked into a gallery, oftentimes there was either nothing there or a pile of stuff that happened during a performance or something. So really art had sort of come to this moment where it had kind of almost visually, at least, disappeared. It kind of went poof. And conceptualism was art about ideas and not about things. And so the next thing that came along is postmodernism. And so there's a big break between like let's say the late 19th century, 1880s, when Impressionism and that sort of stuff was going on, through the mid to late 20th century, with all of the Cubism and other kinds of sort of movements more and more towards abstraction. And then poof, the art object literally disappears and becomes an idea. And then in comes postmodernism, and particularly this exhibition called Pictures. And I mean, it sounds so silly to say it, but there were images of things. There were recognizable pictures of objects again. And that was a really huge shift from what had been going on through most of the 20th century until the 1980s. And so once we saw representational art, narrative art, right? Art that told a story, that had some kind of implied meaning in the work, as opposed to minimalism, for example. It was a big change, and a lot of people didn't accept it at the beginning, but ultimately this really became this sort of dominant practice of many visual artists, especially since then. And so the art world and artists, like non-art people, could actually go into a gallery now and see a thing they recognized, right? As opposed to something that, I think often confused the lay viewer when they went into an art gallery at the time. So This exhibition included, some of the most important artists of the late 20th century, early 21st century. And so it's really important that we sort of look back. I mean, it's not historical in the sense that it was, 200 years ago, like we started with, but it's certainly now, 40 plus years ago, and that's still considered history, right? So if you can't go to the exhibition, of course, I understand. You should sort of look at the exhibition objects on, here, let me share my screen again, and I'll show you the page. Here's the page that, again, I put this URL into the chat so you can copy it yourself. I see a hand up, so yes. Two hands.
Oh yeah, it was just a quick question. The VRE is basically like recording our. You'll probably explain it, like recording our reaction to the exhibition.
Yes, exactly, and it can be making something that we did this a couple weeks ago, right? Where you'd all seen at least the online version of the show at the Whitney, and then either wrote something or made something in response to seeing that exhibition, either virtually or physically. So it's the same idea. I'm looking for you, from my point of view, let me just put it this way. From my point of view, I want to know that you spent a little time looking at the work, considering it, processing it in your own mind, and then responding to that. That's my goal. And so how you respond to that is really up to you. I don't want it to be regurgitating someone else's ideas. And I think that's really important, that you're not going to go and Google it and find out that, the critic for the New York Times, panned it. And then the people at October magazine sort of said it was the greatest exhibition ever. And so really, I want you to respond to it authentically from your own point of view and not take someone else's, criticism or critiques or article and base it on that. There's a lot of work in the show, by the way, so there's a lot of ways to respond to it. I will say that, Cindy Sherman in particular, but Barbara Kruger as well, which we're seeing here, these are some of the most seminal artists of the late 20th century. And so you can sort of thumb through the exhibition objects here and kind of respond to them. So that's the next VRE. It's due in 2 weeks. Okay, so 2 weeks from today, we'll spend some time at the beginning of the lecture sort of discussing the exhibition and how you all sort of responded to it.
Will there be a receptacle for all of our assignments on Blackboard this time, or is it going to be a different format?
No, it'll be on Blackboard again, like the last one.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. AJ, did you have a question earlier?
No. What you were explaining answered my question.
Any other questions? Great. All right, so we were talking about the landscape the last time we were together. I'm going to continue through that lecture. It's obviously very long since we've gone for multiple sessions with it, but so we ended with Shackleton, and Shackleton is the sort of head of an exploration or an expedition to try to get to the North Pole. And he had done this a couple of times previously and failed, but most famously, sort of recently, we were able to recover some of the glass negatives. So what happened is they built this ship to take it up through the Arctic and try to get to the North Pole. And then the ice had sort of gotten them stuck. And then as the ice grew, it just crushed the ship from inside. It just kind of like as the ice got thicker and more and more of it, it just sort of destroyed the ship, and that ends up like that. And so what then happened is all of the materials had to be removed from this vessel, and it was specifically designed to sort of be able to so-called easily cut through the ice, but it didn't actually do that very effectively. And so once they'd sort of accepted that there was no sort of repairing the ship, they sort of, built a camp and ultimately sent, I think, 3 guys and a pair of sled dogs to try to find help. Now, of course, back then, there's not a lot of help up near the North Pole. So but they had hired a photographer to document the expedition. And so the photographer was using wet plate collodion, by the way, the things that we've been talking about. And he did a number of exposures after the ship had been destroyed, because of course, they don't need to save the materials for later, because that's the end of the voyage. And they're sort of interesting images. I think that's a movie camera as well was taken. The sort of what happened when they did finally abandon, the ship and help came, they couldn't bring all the glass plates because glass, as you know, is really heavy. And so they ended up sort of sinking it into the ice. And then later on, they were able to be rescued, and because they'd been in cold water that whole time, and they had very little deterioration. And so they were almost as if they were brand new. And so then, they published it, and I just think it's a really interesting sort of journey. It's a great story. More recently, apparently they found a couple of cases of the whiskey that they had taken with them, and were able to then sort of figure out the recipe of whiskeys in the 19th century. Nobody kept records, I guess, on that. And those bottles of whiskey had also been sort of sunk underwater for all that time. So they'd been perfectly preserved as well, and went for tens of thousands of dollars a bottle for the whiskey people. Here it is, completely crushed. You can see how much damage the ice ultimately did to the ship.
Professor, the photographer was Frank Hurley. Was that his name? Okay. Was it just one photographer, or was there more?
It was just one.
Okay.
So these are some of their camps that they had made after the ship was destroyed and they had to leave it. A lot of times they would turn the lifeboats over and use them as a kind of shelter to sort of work from. So there's the captain and the photographer. And of course, the beautiful dog. It's just a fun story, right? And a cute picture of handsome guy with puppies. Who can't, who can resist that? So, bye, find us help, please. Don't let us die. And they were ultimately rescued. I don't think everybody made it. I actually think the captain died, but I don't remember that detail exactly. So, I've sort of interweaved images and technology together so that we can sort of see the materials that the photographers of the time were using. One of the most famous lenses that was ever made is a lens called the Petzval lens. Now, this lens was, as you can see, it's 8 to 10 inches. Some of them are even bigger than that. Long. It was made out of brass and glass, so it was very heavy compared to contemporary lenses. The lens design specifically was designed for portraiture, and this portraiture lens was extremely sharp in the center and got sort of successively softer as it went out towards the edges of the images. And so that was really great for a portrait because the person's face would be sharp and emphasized, and then the background and other things would, be less sharp and would be sort of de-emphasized. It's actually, still, there's a company that makes this for your DSLRs now. So you can buy a new Petzval lens to put on your Nikon or your Canon or whatever camera you use, your Sony or whatever. And it does have this kind of unique sort of look to the way it renders the image. Coming out of that research was the Chevalier lens, which was also kind of a portrait lens, also brass and glass, getting a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable to carry around. So this one was faster, meaning it took less light to take a picture than the original Petzval lens. So that was desirable, right? People didn't have to sort of sit still with their eyes open as long if you have a lens that lets more light come through. And I just want to really emphasize here, I don't want you to memorize like anything specific about lenses or lens designs. This is not an optics course. That's not the goal. The goal is to sort of talk a little bit about how, remember we saw that, that sort of earliest lens that looked like a bean in a way. It was a double convex lens, very much like a magnifying glass that you would have. And it was designed to light fires back then, but we can see that lenses have really evolved a lot since then. And so, the more advanced the lenses become, the more flexibility the photographer has, the less gear they have to carry with them. And so, I still go out with my view camera and take pictures as often as I can, not during COVID, of course, but and after a couple of hours of traipsing around with the big ass camera that's got, lots of, metal and glass on it, I'm really happy to save a couple of pounds so that it's sort of easier on back and legs, right? So these lenses, let me just say, the lens on the left is like the original mid-19th century Petzval design. That little black circle next to it on the right is a contemporary lens that does exactly what that original Petzval does. So you can see how like the technology evolved from then until that lens is probably from the 1960s or 70s. The lenses themselves are quite beautiful objects. At the top up here, you'll see a dial or a knob that was used to move the lens back and forth to focus the picture. And so these were the cameras that you had to sort of, put the hood over your head, and it had a bellows, and there was a ground glass on the back. People still use those, by the way. Professional photographers especially like them for architecture and landscape photography. So that gear that is there is, as I said, the way that the lens is focused. Now you should notice that there's no shutter at all in them. And you may not have noticed that, but I'm going to point that out. So a lot of times the shutter was the lens cap, and the photographer would sort of take it off and count till 5 or 10 or whatever and put it back on. And that was the shutter. That's obviously not very accurate, but many photographers were able to sort of do that as the way they exposed their plates. And remember, the plates were very slow. So, we're not talking fractions of a second like we take pictures today. And these are multiple seconds long, depending on how much light you're working with. So, so getting back to the concepts of the landscape, and this guy specifically, Minor White, was an educator, a photographer, an artist, a Buddhist, publisher. He started a magazine called Aperture Magazine, which still is kind of the best photography magazine in the world. He started a gallery, which still exists in Chelsea, today. I don't know if it's actually open today because of COVID, but it still exists. And that gallery has a publishing house attached to it, and they put out not only the magazine, but a lot of really great books on photography. And Minor was really kind of at the forefront in the mid 20th century. We talked about Stieglitz and his importance in the beginning of the 20th century. Minor kind of took on that role as kind of the person who was championing photography as an art. He taught at RIT and a few other places. And he sort of taught both using Ansel Adams' zone system, which we briefly discussed, how the photographer can so-called pre-visualize the image. But he also taught a more sort of, I don't know, kind of intuitive way of thinking about photography. Because he himself was a Buddhist, he had these ideas that, you could sort of, photography could be more poetic than factual. And I'm trying to be kind because some of the things he said are really flaky. He was my teacher's teacher, by the way. And my teacher used to say that when they would have critiques, minor, not every time, but minor, would occasionally say, I want you to put your pictures up on the wall. You can't say anything. I want you to dance to them. And that would be the sort of critique structure that he would kind of set up. And, I think both his influence as a teacher, a publisher, a gallery director, and a photographer himself are all really important. And many of his students went on to be some of the more important American photographers after the 1960s. He was also gay, and so he was obviously not out. And a lot of the pictures that he made for himself and for his community were really never published until after his death. And so, a lot of the pictures that he's best known for are these kind of images that are kind of, spiritual, ethereal, maybe kind of abstract, right? I always love that image on the left. It's really such a beautiful picture that light seems to actually have a physical presence in the room. And the ones on the right are really sort of, in a way, in congruence with what's going on in painting at the time, which would have been pure abstract expressionism with these kind of bold brushstrokes and large splats of color and things. So if you think of a Jackson Pollock painting, for example, Jack the Dripper, and you look at that bottom right picture, you can sort of see, okay, there's a relationship between Jackson Pollock and the way that that Miner was sort of approaching photography, right? They're lovely, they're quiet, they're still, they're poetic, they're metaphorical. They're both, simultaneously representational, obviously, because he's taking a picture of something, but also simultaneously abstract, and can be sort of talked about in the terms that abstract painting was talked about at that point in the evolution of painting. So, because of his sexuality, he really was not very well known outside of the photography community, the way that Stieglitz became just kind of a star in himself and Steichen after him. But all of his friends knew and really, supported him and were very helpful. He also favored or championed or personally liked infrared film, which is an interesting thing. I mean, you can, these days you can have a DSLR actually sort of converted to infrared. And a lot of photographers, like after they've bought their second or third camera body, because DSLRs don't last more than a few years these days, they will have one of their older camera bodies converted to infrared. Interestingly, actually, all they do is they remove a filter that's built into the sensor, because the sensor itself sees the whole spectrum from ultraviolet to infrared. And then they put a filter on top of it to sort of only let it see what we call visible light. In other words, the light that humans can see. So because of the infrared film, the images that you see have a lot of this kind of glowing, especially like anything with chlorophyll in it, causes that really glowy effect that happens when you point an infrared camera at it. Of course, you can't see it with your eye. And so when at least when you're using infrared film, you really don't know exactly what's going to happen. With an infrared DSLR, of course, you've got a lot more sort of control of that. But it gave these pictures this kind of luminance to them. And they're also very contrasty negatives. I've shot it a few times and I've always had trouble printing it because especially trees and grass and bushes and stuff will just wash out. You can shoot it at night as well to get sort of unusual effects. So Miner was this sort of seminal character. He taught, a lot of the people who then went on to become the photo teachers of the next generation. Now he was, after World War II, what happened was a lot of American universities, there was something called the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was essentially a promise from the federal government that if you went to serve in the war, when you came back, if you came back, of course, they would pay for your college. And that was a huge thing in this country because all of a sudden there were all these young, mostly men who were on the GI Bill and would be able to attend colleges. So universities around the country started growing, and in particular, art departments began to sort of expand. Art departments had prior been just, very small parts of the institution. And now they began to add faculty members in all the disciplines, including photography. So photography prior to this in the academic world had been sort of delegated to more like a trade, like a trade school. You'd go to learn portrait photography in 6 weeks, and that would be your education. But now, universities that offer associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees, even master's degrees, were offering photography in the institution. And so because of Miner's teaching, most of his, I shouldn't say most of his, most of the teachers that then began to teach in those institutions had studied with him, or at least studied with somebody who'd studied with him or studied about him in some way. So that kind of education, became a very important thing. The GI Bill, educated a significant part of the population that prior to that would not have been able to go to college at all. Colleges went from something that was very specifically for the elite, the children of the elite, the sort of top 5% of the country, if you will, to the kind of thing that working class, middle class people could begin to afford. And Miner's, approach to photography is not only a craft and a trade, but also as a kind of, poetic, personal expression was really important. So Anna Mendieta is a really interesting artist in so many ways. And she died very young, which was really tragic. And some people think she was killed by her boyfriend, and some people think she fell off the balcony in Soho by accident because she was drinking. But as an artist, she, I put her in the photography lectures because the essence of her work ended up as photographs, right, as photographic images. But really, her practice had a lot more to do with performance than photography. And I kind of mentioned that idea last week when we were together, how in the 70s, particularly, I said last time that photography snuck into the high art galleries through performance. And she's one of the artists that was kind of partially about. So she would do these performances often, if not always, kind of merging her female body with the earth, with some sort of natural element. Sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's, other than on earth, but often it was the earth. And she would become sort of part of that. And then using photography would document those experiences, those performances, if you will. They're kind of sculptural in a way. And it's really this kind of interesting mix of performance, sculpture, and photography, all in kind of one place. Subject was almost universally herself, although I think really it's not her as a self-portrait, but really her as a kind of iconic female figure, sort of representing, as we've also talked about, this kind of Gaia mythology, which she was also interested in, and how life and the planet is a kind of feminine power. And she was sort of trying to emphasize how the feminine sort of brings that about. So the 70s, you know, in the world was a huge thing. It made a lot of changes to politics, the visual arts, photography, music, you know, almost every sort of creative discipline you can think of was influenced heavily by the late 60s sort of revolutions. And in a way that relates back to what I was saying about the GI Bill, because now, you know, in the 60s, after World War II, we've got a lot more people going to college, a lot more sort of, you know, people sort of like thinking, well, this is a pretty good lifestyle. Let's try to sort of stay in college as long as possible and learn. And the politics of a lot of those educated people became sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't really call it radical, but obviously kind of leftist. And they were protesting the war. There was a lot of protest about, you know, the FBI and the CIA surveillance and other kinds of issues. And so photography, along with music and all the other kinds of things, really changed a lot. So one of those, I thought there would be more pictures by him, but I guess we'll see them in another lecture. So, you know, all right, I'm confused. Anyways, okay, so then also at Rochester Institute of Technology, along with Minor, but later after Minor White had sort of stopped teaching, came along this guy who kind of took his role after Minor had retired, called John Fall. And John Fall sort of emphasized the sort of single lens thing that photography is unique for. So he was interested in making and altering the landscape, making pictures instead of taking pictures, so to speak, altering the landscape from that single one-point perspective that photography has, that's really kind of unique to the discipline or the medium. And at least this picture initially looks kind of, you know, I mean, they're funny, like he just added aluminum foil in that gap between the sand and the sky where the water is. So this is a good example of it. Initially, you sort of look at this and go, oh, big deal, he made a rectangle, oh my. But really, it's much, much more complex than that, because the lines that he drew on these rocks had to conform to the shape of the rocks, which he found. He didn't alter their location or their arrangement in any way, to make it look like, from the single point of view of the lens, that it's a rectangle, a broken rectangle, but still a rectangle. When if you were to look at it from any other point of view, these lines would be going sort of up and down and left and right and over and up and down, and you know. And so from that one point of view, we get this rectangular line that happens. From any other point of view, that line is varying in shape all through the image, all through the environment, I should say. You know, some of them were just kind of recognizing patterns that seemed similar to other patterns, how the ocean waves look like lace. So they were playful, they're kind of fun. They're, you know, sometimes easy and simple, sometimes really complex. There's another one that, you know, it looks to us as viewers that, you know, these lines are straight, but again, they're really not. If they were straight, they wouldn't actually appear straight to the camera, if that makes sense. So like, this is probably the easiest one to understand. These oranges are not on the path. They're actually hanging from wires right in front of the camera. And by using different scale oranges, it gives the illusion that they're receding in space, but actually they're just all at the same plane in front of the camera. And so they're visual jokes. They're kind of punny, funny in a way. They're playful. They're, you know, having to do with the environment, which is another thing that was important in the 70s. We started to get more, we called it the green movement back then, and you know, environmentalism became much more, you know, important, and more people were getting concerned with it. There was smog in all the cities, and I mean, New York is on the ocean, so we never had it as bad, but places like LA and Chicago were often, very much covered in smog. And so, artists began to deal with the environment. And this is another artist that also dealt with the environment in a variety of sort of punny, funny ways, playfulness, Robert Fichter. So he had this kind of cast of characters in his mind that he reused and recycled in different images. His thoughts were like, what would happen after the nuclear bomb dropped? He was a kid that would have been raised in the era where duck and cover was part of the regular school time activities. And duck and cover, if you don't know what that means, it was when children would be taught that if the nuclear bomb dropped, they should get underneath their school desks and put their head between their hands and hope then that the nuclear blast wouldn't, kill them that way, which is of course a joke, because if you're that close to a nuclear bomb, the radiation is going to kill you. It's almost better to go out with the actual explosion than to slowly die of the radiation. Now, so he worked in Rochester for a while, but then he moved to Florida to teach. And so this is sort of one of the images where he's sort of starting to begin to think about how, what would happen, what would the world look like after the bomb dropped? And so we'll see some more of his, but this is a controlled burn fire in Florida with some of his characters at the top kind of superimposed on top of it. Joel Meyerowitz is probably best known as a street photographer, but he also did this whole series up in Cape May of just sort of the water and the sky. Another contemporary photographer is Todd Hito. And remember, I'm not going too deeply into a lot of these people. I'm really kind of exposing you to names and images so that you might think, oh, Todd Hito's an interesting photographer. Maybe I'll do my oral presentation on that person. Or I'm doing my research paper, research project for the end about, contemporary urban photography. This guy kind of fits into that, right? I always think of him as the drive-by shooter, which isn't really fair, but it's kind of interesting that, most photographers like bring their equipment with them and they get out and they stomp around and they find the right place to set up their tripod. And he would often literally shoot from inside the car, not even roll down the windows. And so we get in this image on the right, there's a kind of blurriness that's uneven through the picture, and that's because there's rain on the window that he photographed through. They're often about either suburbia or the sort of hand of man, which I'd also talked about recently. And so showing the effect of humans on the natural environment. But these are the ones that have always been interesting to me. These kind of suburban, suburbia was supposed to be the sort of utopia, this utopian idea of you could work in the city to make the money and you could go home to this kind of quiet, picket fence in the yard kind of situation. But his pictures have this kind of underlying, like, it looks like something's in the shadows there that I don't want to meet, or there's a kind of eeriness about them, almost like there's something scary lurking back there. People, when I moved to New York 30 something years ago, people would say, how do you go there? It's so scary. You're going to get mugged and you're going to get shot. And then like, now when I go back to my home and I'm terrified because there's nothing around. Like there's just all this quiet and anything could be happening. At least in New York, we know like there's somebody around the corner, that might do something, I don't know, it's New York, but these kind of places have that kind of odd, strange, almost, it's like the opening scene of a horror film or something. But often shot from the road, directly from the road, from the street, often at dusk or at night. And, they're also really beautiful in a way. It's also kind of everyday. We had talked about the new topographics last week. Remember the people who changed from the Ansel Adams sort of beauty of grandeur of nature to how humans were impacting the landscape and the environment. And Hito sort of follows in that sense, in that way. Catherine Opie is a West Coast photographer. She's also a teacher, I think, at UCLA. So this project was sort of using a panoramic camera, 6x17 cm camera, and making just contact prints from them. But these were my favorites. These were I don't have a car anymore, but I used to, and when I drive, I'd always be fascinated by the architecture of like those exits from like the super highways, you know, the interstates, and there'd be these sort of like can of worms, and all the roads would kind of be like crossing, and you'd go under one and over another one, and it'd be a circle. And so she began photographing that kind of those things, you know, and making very small but very beautiful platinum contact prints. We talked about platinum printing in the pictorialist era. And so she had sort of gone back and chosen that kind of process to make these small, beautiful platinum prints of these very sort of concrete jungle-like images. She's also one of the important leaders in the gay community in photography. She's one of the people who've always sort of cited as being highly influential to bring the homosexual caucus into visibility more. And that's as important as her photography and her teaching, I think. So she did a whole series of portraits of gay folks in really sort of very straightforward and clear ways. Sally Mann. Now, she is very well known, probably one of the top 10 most well-known photographers. She is, this image, by the way, is from a series that she did about Civil War battlefields and what they look like today. She's from the South. She adopted the wet plate collodion process that, again, was that 19th century process, and she still does that. And that's what gives her these pictures that kind of, you know, foggy, ethereal kind of look. She's not very good at the process, but I think that's on purpose. So remember when I showed that guy pouring a plate, and, you know, he'd pour that sticky, like honey-like substance and then have to get it evenly on there. And she doesn't do a very good job at that very often. But as I said, I think that's on purpose. So this, again, is from that series about Civil War battlefields and what they look like today. And then she prints using contemporary photo paper, but then toning it to look sort of like 19th century processes. These are lovely and beautiful and really wonderful. That kudzu, especially in the Southeast, is sort of everywhere in certain places. It's an invasive species, and sort of cypress tree knees. I'm going to show this because I think, well, I think it's worth seeing. And yes, it is. And if I can. So, all right, so Art 21 was a series that is still going on, actually, about sort of interviewing contemporary artists who are working today, sort of showing how artists think and work. So let me get, stop this share. I'd mentioned her teacher in a previous
growing up as a child of Sally Mann was not easy at all. Anyone who's as driven as Sally Mann is gonna be an intense mother. She's difficult, and for as much as I get annoyed and struggle against it and fight it, I love it at the same time. So it's such a yin and a yang.
God, it does look like the Shroud of Turin or something. It looks so ponderous. Whereas this looks so ephemeral. God, they're just two different pictures. Some pictures just have to be a certain way, but this doesn't seem to cry out to be either light or dark. Which just makes my job harder, actually.
Every time she looks at something, she's looking at it as an artist. It's so much of her energy. And so I think we lost, to some extent, a mother, but we gained a friend and an artistic accomplice and something entirely different.
It's a tremendous effort that goes into it. Sally will have a pile of what I think are beautiful prints. And those are the rejects. And I'm singing, God.
This is a tough one. What I like about these dog bones is their ambiguity. It takes you a while to figure out what they are, or maybe you don't figure it out. And I love, if it doesn't have ambiguity, don't bother to take it. I mean, I love that aspect of photography, the mendacity of photography. It's got to have some kind of peculiarity in it, or it's not interesting to me.
Do right. Just stay there.
If I could be said to have any kind of aesthetic, it's sort of a magpie aesthetic. I just go around and I pick up whatever is around. It's very spontaneous. I see a dog bone, I bring it in, I take a picture, I like the picture I took. I thought, hey, that's a pretty good picture. So then I go collect all the other dog bones and I bring them in and I take a few more pictures. And then I put them on the wall. And then before long, the gallery says, well, let's do a show of dog bones. So we do a show of dog bones. And then some cynical, postmodern critic will come along and say, oh my God, look at the show of dog bones. What do you suppose it means? It's, oh.
Yeah, it's a good dog. That's right. Go get it.
These dog bones are just making art the way art should be made, I think, without any overarching reference. Just for fun, if you can imagine that. Art for fun. Sometimes it is fun. There's a lot of dispute about the proper way to hold this glass. I learned how to do this from a master. He's a genius teacher, and he really knows wet plate collodion. His name's Mark Osterman. It's a sort of cranky process. It doesn't allow for much sloppy technique. It's hard to get these chemicals. They're all, controlled. Collodion and ether, and of course grain alcohol you can get, but you can't get it in Virginia. Then you take it to the silver nitrate.
Ugh, it's a bug in here.
And for reasons that escape me completely, the silver nitrate sticks to the collodion and ether and coats it. My plates are horribly flawed, but of course it's the flaws I like, so you pray. In your prayer, you pray, please don't let me screw it up, but just screw it up a little bit, just enough to make it interesting.
I'm so stupid. I have to use one hand to hold my shutter shut. I have to use a head to keep the camera from moving. There's got to be an easier way. All right, well, what do you think? 30 seconds, I'd say.
Actually, I'm surprised it took me this long to get to this process because I was so immersed in that whole glass plate 19th century aesthetic.
Like that one. There's Jenna being the weirdo again.
Oh, and now the splitter.
She's so normal looking now. No one would know that she was.
She was just beautiful then. She was.
I know she was.
She looked like someone that stepped out of the wrong century.
Yeah.
Great little model though.
Most incredible little girl.
She could put on a coat like nobody's business.
She could throw a fit like nobody's
Well,
business.
that's true too.
The way I approach photography, it's very spontaneous. The children were there, so I took pictures of my children. It's not that I'm interested in children that much or photographing them. It's just that they were there.
She would call us her model, but usually it was just something where she would say freeze and we'd stop what we were doing. Sometimes she'd make some small alteration, but that was all. The one where my hair is on my ribs. I remember that I had to keep going back and wetting my hair because it would dry and then slip. So that's the only thing that I remember.
Do you remember how many times we took that picture?
Yes. I
And it
remember.
was a production because someone had to sit behind you in the river and thwack the river with the canoe to make those little ripples that are behind you.
That's what I was doing.
Yeah, you were thwacking the river and she
Right.
was standing there keeping her hair from falling off her ribs
Right.
and still maintaining a beatific expression. That was a really hard picture to take.
I want one of those family pictures to look effortless. I wanted them to look like snapshots. There is something about the whole 8x10 business, the sort of reverence that goes along with it, that you have to pay your dues to the photo gods, I guess.
You know, my mother's vision, she had an idea, it's almost like a dream, I think she has, like a dream picture, and she just gradually like refines it until it's exactly what she's looking for. It took like 5 separate trips out here and taking probably like 15 to 20 pictures every single time. She was looking, every time she took a picture, I mean, I knew she was looking for that intensity that I feel like my sisters and I have, my mother has. It's just like this intensity, man intensity. I don't know what it is. It plagues me to this day.
It was my father who gave me almost all my cameras, the first half dozen, I guess. He was an atheist who practiced compassionate medicine 60 hours a week. He was enough of a socialist to believe you shouldn't have to pay for it if you couldn't. But he was also an art collector. I mean, he bought Kandinsky in the 30s and Twombly in the 50s. And he was quite an unusual man and hell to live up to. But then, of course, my mother, in all different kinds of poses here. You couldn't have two more disparate backgrounds. My mother with this like blue blood New England, and my father sort of a renegade Texan. But I was the third child, 2 older brothers. And I sort of think by the time I came along, everyone was tired of raising children. It wasn't that they neglected me. It was a benign neglect, I guess. I know I never wore clothes. Every picture of me is naked. And they had 12 boxers, so I was always surrounded by a pack of dogs. I just ran wild for the first 7 years of my life, and then went to school and didn't take to it too kindly. But I was eventually civilized. I guess that's a little how I raised my own kids, and a little why I was so nonplussed when people were surprised to see the pictures of my children without shirts and pants and running wild too. It seemed like a perfectly normal thing to do to me.
I don't think I've ever seen this one before.
So that's an example. You see your hand in that? You see how your gesture is? You didn't have that clunky child thing. You were so svelte and sylph-like.
everyone looks at these pictures and it's like, you must have had the most amazing childhood. You did. I was literally a water nymph until I was 12, I think. It wasn't magical at the time, but looking back on it, it's kind of like. But then, she said that all the pictures started looking like fashion ads. So she had to do something else.
I love the landscapes. I don't have any problem with them. I was ready to stop taking pictures. I was like, no more taking pictures.
I'd argue that the landscapes are going to be the ones that she's going to be remembered for. In the end, that's going to be what's going to be the most lasting body of work.
I don't think so. I think immediate family was actually. Pictures of us were actually. No, just like, no,
Yeah.
but.
Because these are the most interesting subject matter.
Well, certainly.
But these have the better skill. It's funny because Mom's so. You have to leave, Mom. Just stupid talking about her. She's in the room. She was raised with no sense of God in such an atheistic family. And you'll never hear her say anything spiritual or religious.
Spiritual, maybe.
Even then, she's like, I don't want to get too touchy-feely. She's really against that stuff. But I think it's her Bible. It's her expression of a spirituality that she can't say without feeling stupid. Maybe it's the same thing with immediate family, sort of a maternal understanding, maternal love that is so hard to express, so she took pictures.
I know my mother loves the South. Like, there's something just incredible about places that don't have malls and have like a real sense of history. And I feel like, especially in the United States, like that is being destroyed so quickly.
Of course, I can't see anymore because I'm blind. Do you have your reading glasses, Larry?
Dad is just as much a part of Mom. Their relationship is so much tied with the land, and I feel like they just are really aware of how important maintaining a sense of beauty in what surrounds you.
You can make a print of it.
I just love the feel of the large images. Often I'll be there when the image is being made. It's just part of a continuum.
It is. Basically, it's basically pretty good. Looks nice against the black.
You know, you feel like you're intimately involved in the whole process, and yet once that final image hits the wall, it's got a life of its own. It's a wonderful experience altogether.
Ah.
Just a little lighter?
Over my heart.
Okay, so what do you think? Any thoughts?
Yeah. It's Omari. It's just really amazing to see what is, I guess, considered art and beautiful, because the line pretty much seems to be arbitrary, because anyone could, I mean, I don't know, because there's different interpretations. Like someone could look at her art and be like, oh my God, why is she capturing her children in such, in such nudity? And then someone else will look at it and be like, oh my God, this is so expressive and beautiful. Look at the crevices and the shadows. I found it to be jarring at first, but then once I tapped into my open-minded, artistic, mind, then I'm just like, okay, I can see, some of the beauty behind, I guess, what she was capturing, because there is some kind of like Garden of Eden naturalistic beauty to, everybody's body. But I guess in the culture that I grew up in, I'm seeing those images, and then I'm hearing, Neverland Ranch Michael Jackson vibes, where it's just like, you know, maybe Michael Jackson wanted to appreciate, you know, his childhood, but, you know, the Black community kind of frowned upon that because it's just like, I don't let my kids sleep over at nobody's house. So, I mean, I appreciated, you know, her artwork once I, you know, opened my mind up to it.
Well, I mean, I think that that's really insightful in a lot of ways. And, you know, I haven't shown much of the still images from immediate family, which those pictures were from that book. That was her first book. And it got a lot of attention for some of the exact reasons you're saying, which is, you know, underage nudity. And, you know, as a parent, I have very strong thoughts about this. As a parent who's a photographer, especially, but I'd like to hear what other people have to say.
I want to comment that I had the same thoughts, I think, as Omar for these pictures for a long time, but I think this documentary is excellent in a sense that it makes her work so inherent to who she is. There is something, and the fact that they put her dogs and her husband and her children in the documentary, it's really emphasized it more. There is this side of paradise and living in paradise side to her. And maybe it's our society that looks at nudes differently because it's hypocritic, because the way she shows it, it's very natural. But our society is really full of child pornography. Nobody says anything. And here it's not. It's really what I said before. It's inherent to who she is. It's really an art that reflects very profoundly a person. I liked it very much.
Great, thank you.
I also wanted to last comment on how amazing it is once you get your family to buy in on an idea. And then it's like amazing how her kids and her children, you know, they're all part of that. You know, from the outside looking in, it may seem like cult-like, how everybody's, you know, so one-minded and focus-minded on just the artistic side. And they've been a part of this since kids, and they don't seem to have any kind of, you know, repressed feelings or negativity about it. They're, you know, remarking at their, you know, participation in this. And, you know, it's amazing to see that, how everybody's so aligned with, you know, with that movement, that artistic movement.
Okay.
Sorry, Professor.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I find it ironic that I find it ironic that she was the photographer. What's her name?
Sally Mann.
Sally Mann. Okay, she was so into nature, but she wasn't into religion. Her pictures were natural. Where she lived was natural. She didn't want to be around any type of mall or anything like that. She wanted to live out in the open, you know, everything was natural, but she had no spiritual, she had no specific religion, which is funny because everything she was around in terms of, you know, the earth, the world, but she didn't connect to any religion per se, was ironic to me.
Does anybody else? I see there's some things in the chat. All right, so I just want to say a couple of things. So the boy, his name is Emmett. Remember we talked about Emmett Gowan last time we were together? Now Emmett Gowan was her teacher, and I showed some of his pictures of his family that he'd made. one of his wife peeing, I think, is probably the one you most vividly remember. And so, she named her son after Emmett Gowan, and yet she never sort of acknowledges his influence on her in these kinds of interviews. For me, I think that the comment that I really sort of always rail about when I show this is her, the audacity, and to me, it's just unbelievable gall to say that sort of thread of the conversation where she was saying, well, I, make pictures of dog bones, and then this New York dealer comes down and he gives me a show, and I put up a show, and and then the postmodern critic comes in and says, what do the dog bones mean? Just fuck you. I really, that annoys me to no end. That kind of the privilege that she has to be exhibited in New York, sell these prints for $10,000 to $50,000 each, and then rail against, this relationship with the press, and the press, of course, is what made her famous in the first place. For some of the reasons Omari was suggesting, that those pictures of her children were kind of controversial, and they were writing about that, and she dismissed that too, like, oh, I was raised naked, so I didn't think anything about it. That it drives me crazy. Like, I take naked pictures of my son, or I did when he was in the bathtub a few times, not often. I'm not going to put them in a gallery. I'm not going to publish them in any way that the public can get access to. I know better than that. She, for that flippancy attitude, that flippant attitude she had about the sexuality of her children, later on, it came out that she had a stalker who lived in her county, very close to where her house is, that was trying to get to her children. And then the worst of it all to me is that her son Emmett Gowan committed suicide when he was about 20. And so, to sort of, the comment that he made in the interview where, we really lost a mother, but we gained a friend, like, and ultimately that's his sort of very sad end. I really just, the kind of arrogance, the kind of just complete indifference to the realities of the world, to me, that she shows in some of those comments is really kind of shocking. So, I have to say that I like the pictures. I think they're beautiful. I think she makes lovely images. I love that she uses the 19th century processes that we've been talking about in class so far. But I think some of her own words seemed to me to be rather like out of context and misunderstanding the reality of the world we live in. I see, Cole, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I actually was going to point out the same quote by Emmett that you did, where he said that he felt like, yeah, he missed out on having a mother. And yes, when giving the quote, he seemed to indicate that was okay, but it's often really not for people, and clearly in his case it wasn't. And her attitude toward her own children did seem quite callous. And
yeah,
I think it probably has to do with like personal experiences of mine in my life, that the loss of a parent as a parental figure and having them as something else it's not really a replacement, and obviously Emmett suffered for it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Professor, I agree as well with your comments. I stepped away for a second because I had to use the bathroom, but as I was watching as she was speaking, and I could see her sitting in the background while the filmmakers filming her family, and you could just see there's an arrogance about her, completely missing the reality, like you said. And it's really, it's horrible. I feel as though that she used her children in that way, callously, like Cole just said. There was a point that I wanted to make was she made a point about saying she's shooting these dog bones just because, you know, for the hell of it or whatever it is. But she still goes through the trouble of staging. I mean, she really staged her children's photographs. So you know, like there's a contradiction with her, with what she says. Yeah.
All right, thank you. There's a couple other people who have some comments. AJ?
Yeah, as I was like seeing like the interview and like having like the everyone like say like the comments, like when I was little, I always like thought of like becoming like a graphic designer and like becoming like an artist, to have like these to see like the viewpoint of like what of like how the world is to like an artist. I had never before seen someone such as her, with such a complete and utter indifference to what she was doing in order to create her craft. I had never witnessed such a thing before, but like and how the son was saying like I lost a mother, but I gained a friend. Like, you knew that in his voice he was forcing that comment. It wasn't something that was completely natural to him. You knew that he was hurt when he said that.
I agree. I think that's really insightful. Ashley, you had a comment?
Yeah, everybody more or less said like what I was thinking. I just feel like she saw like her children more as objects that she can, I guess, make money off of, more so than an actual family member, just because the way like she was raised and things like that. And it's like, usually, as I'm not a parent, but usually, you know, um when you want to be a parent or you're going to be a parent, you try not to make the same mistakes your parents made because you want to be better than that. But it seems like she was still kind of on that like whole entire level. I just feel like I like the whole video, like her artwork was cool, but I don't like her. Like, I can clearly say like she was really arrogant, and just like the way she presented herself, like she was like standoff, like show offy. And he like, even in the interview, like it's one of those things where it's like I can like the artwork but not the artist. And it's like, because seeing that video, it makes me want to like really think about how artwork is like, are you really doing this for the sake of like, because you like feel like, oh man, I saw this thing, I really want to do it because you know, it's really are going to present, or are you doing it for money? And it's one of those things where it's like it should be not really a balance, but you should probably do something that you probably would feel really passionate about rather than just money and not caring about it. So that's just my take about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, she, just to talk about the money side of things, is probably one of the most collected contemporary photographers. Her prints go for, you know, 5 to 6 figures, meaning, you know, over $10,000 each, and up to $100,000 each. And so, you know, there's, I guess that's 4 to 5 figures, but anyways, you know, she's had such success financially that, you know, I don't know if that's why she makes art or not, but yeah. So Gregory, do you have something to say? You have your hand up?
Yes, I think everybody also said everything. So I just wanted to add on that I I am Dominican, and in my country sometimes we do run around naked, so I can kind of relate to what she was doing, but for her to take photos of it and show everyone is the only part that I don't agree with. I think maybe at most you will save them as family photos for the family to look through and like make, jokes and stuff. But to make money of it, I think it's taken a little bit too far. But then she made up for it when she did landscape, which I believe will be what she will be remembered for. Like the girl said, I think it's a better way for her to use her time instead of just forcing her children to pose.
I think, you know, the point that you made about, you and your country and people that run around naked and it's not a big deal. I think that's perfectly fine. When I get the opportunity to take my clothes off, I do. I mean, why not? It's comfortable. But I still think there's a difference between doing that and then putting them on a gallery wall and into a book and publishing that for the world. And that seems to me the line that is difficult for many people, many of us, and already we've talked about it. That sort of, you know, that separation between doing photography for yourself and then publishing it for the world is, I think, one of the real differences that people are talking about here. So just a couple more questions. I see that Asia said, I want to quickly comment that say that I've noticed how bland her pictures seem to all be black and white and her home lacked color. Her art is beautiful, but when she had to do it in order to make it is something that I don't agree with. She only thinks about her and the outcome of the process, not the subjects. Okay, yeah. Cole wrote, if you're able to look at the photographs formally for the rhythm of the shapes of the water, the play of light and dark, etc., that changes things. They're nude children's bodies, yes, but they're also shapes in the space of nature. Well, I think that for many people, including myself, that is kind of a dilemma here. And one of the comments that was made sort of referenced this difference between the artist as a person and the art they make, right? I recognize that these pictures are beautiful. I understand why she is successful the way she is, although I know a lot of photographers who do beautiful work and didn't become art stars. But that's not the point. You know, the separation between you know, Pablo Picasso was an asshole, right? I mean, he was a misogynist. He treated his wives poorly, his mistresses even more poorly. But as an artist, his work is kind of a seminal part of art history. And so, you know, thinking about the individual maker versus the objects they make can sometimes be you know, difficult, and especially if we do this with 21st century standards on, let's say, early 20th century artists or prior to that. So injecting our sort of contemporary standards or morality onto somebody who was making art 100 years ago is maybe more problematic than doing that with someone who's working now and sort of ignoring the common understanding that children's nudity is beautiful, sure, but it's also something that should stay private. The last comment I do want to make is that there's another photographer whose name is sort of, I've lost it right now, but he also photographs nude sort of teens going through that change from childhood to adulthood, completely with the parents' not only permission but participation in the projects, and makes very beautiful, lovely prints with an 8x10 view camera in a similar way that Sally Mann uses. But he got arrested by the FBI. His equipment and all of his negatives were confiscated. He was pursued and you know, charged with child pornography. There's no sexuality in his pictures, by the way. It is, you know, the sort of last comment I guess I'm making about this is like, it matters that she's a woman, right? If a man had done exactly the same thing that she had done, I think we would all be looking at that very, very differently. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my sort of feeling. No, it's not Larry Clark.
I have a question. Can I make a comment, like more a question?
Sure. Unless, okay,
because this theme now for many of us is a question of how to relate between a person and his art. Like, because you have Carl Andre, that many accuse him of pushing Mendieta, and then you have even Auguste Rodin, that he sexually harassed Camille Claudel. So what's, and you talk about Picasso, and I guess there are many. So now that we reread history of art, I don't know, in a way we have to reread all these artists or not. I don't know, but it's a very big question now.
I understand. And I don't think it's one we should try to answer in this forum. I mentioned it just because the context of her. It's why I show the documentary, because I think it makes it very clear to people, that her work is one thing and herself is another thing. And so, but yes, I agree with you that, if we start sort of picking on any artists from the past, and, we have killers and we have, sexual predators, and a long list of artists in art history. But that's not something I think we should address too much here. All right, I see 2 hands are still up, and then we should probably take a break. So Cole, did you have something to say again? No?
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. I just forgot to take my hand down.
That's fine. Okay, so it's 12:41. Why don't we take our break now? Hello, everybody. We're back. I think that was a really good discussion that we just had. It's great to have those kinds of, sort of interpreting someone else's work and talking about it as a group. It's certainly one of the things I miss most about sort of IRL, in real life classes, that, I'm able to see in students' eyes and in their expressions that, oh, maybe we should stop and talk about this a little bit more, which is impossible for me to do in this kind of forum. But let's go ahead and move on, because we do have more to cover and I want to finish this lecture today. So Michael Kenna is one of the more successful art photographers working right now. It's kind of because I think his landscape, black and white landscape photographs are really lovely and beautiful, and they're the prints are in-person gorgeous objects, and sort of very graphic, very sort of designed in a way. In some ways, I think they sort of go a little bit towards cliche at times, and that's a hard thing to say about any kind of photographer, but it is something that, we know that there are lots of photo cliches, and a few of his images seem to get close to that. I mean, they're not.
Sorry, what was the name of this photographer again? I missed it.
Michael Kenna.
Okay, thank you.
So, I think in a lot of ways he's just kind of perfected the kind of things that many photographers have been doing over the years. But we've seen these images before, at least I feel that way. Like I've seen, I love this image. I think it's great, but I think I've seen it somewhere else, and probably at Jay made it. But that's not a terrible thing to say about somebody, certainly. So Thomas Struth is part of that Dusseldorf Academy crew. He also, I think I showed these when we talked about the Dusseldorf School, but these are pictures of, they seem like nature, but they're really an indoor greenhouse garden somewhere in, I think, central Berlin. And so, they're kind of like meta landscapes, or almost the new topographics kind of thing. Salgado. Now here is another somewhat controversial to some people photographer. I think that Salgado's work is stunning. He often, for a large part of his career, focused on workers, focused on the environmental issues, particularly the melting glaciers and ice in the Arctic. This is from a series of pictures of after the first Iraqi war. I think that was the first Bush. as the Iraqis were sort of retreating back from the bombings of the US planes were doing, they basically set the oil field wells on fire as they were leaving. And so these two men that you see here are actually volunteers from a Scandinavian country, I can't remember which one, who came to fix the burning oil wells, oil in this oil field. And the kind of environmental damage that just, spewing oil all over the landscape does. They seem to look like almost like statues to me. And that that sheen on them makes it almost look like they're made of metal or something. He's a very ethical photographer in the sense that he really tries to use photography to change the world, to affect social change in some way. His pictures are, beautiful. This is one of my favorite series that he ever did. It's of these, I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's somewhere in South America. Of these are diamond miners, if I'm not correct. I think they're diamond miners, and the sort of the physical labor that those men do to retrieve diamonds from this mine. There's more of them, and they're really amazing looking. He also goes into places where there's famine and other kinds of issues. There's more from the I think it's diamond mining project that he did. And, the pictures are beautiful. And I think sometimes that's, I kind of wonder in my mind, like, if we make suffering, like this is a famine, beautiful, is that like, should we do that? Or maybe if we do that, more people will look at the pictures than if the pictures are hard to see. I don't have an answer for that. I don't think there is an answer for that, but it's just something I've always noticed with his photography is that he looks, he makes terrible things look beautiful sometimes.
It doesn't seem like he exploits it though. It seems like, he just takes the picture at the right time. It doesn't look staged at all with the smoke and, like the colors, the contrasting colors and all that. Not colors, but black and whites.
I get it. I agree with you. I think that, and when I was initially exposed to him early on, I was, concerned that he seemed to be using like people at the worst points in their lives for his own benefit. But I realized over time that he wasn't doing that he wasn't doing it for his own benefit. Although he did, of course, become a famous internationally worldwide known photographer, I think that the actual motivation for it was genuine, and he has done a lot to give back to the communities that he's gone to that are struggling. This is, I think, is a good example of that idea that I just said, how gorgeous an image it is, but yet obviously this is people starving. So AJ, did you have your hand up? And Jessica. So AJ.
When I was looking at these photos, I agreed with what she said, that this didn't appear staged at all. This actually looked completely genuine. And when I saw the diamond miners, it reminded me of, I'm not sure if anyone remembers this movie called Blood Diamonds, where they were like depicting like how harsh and how like and like how difficult like the mining life was. And the reason why they call it blood diamonds is because often or not, when you find a big one, you have to protect it or you will be shedding your own blood.
Right. Yes, and then the relationship between the enforcers, so to speak, and the workers is really violent and dangerous, because the enforcers are like wanting to stop these miners from finding one and then inserting it somewhere it can't be found.
But there is another thing that I wanted to say, that it wasn't really the photographer that I think would be like the person or people that would say like this was staged. I think it would be like the people like viewing these that would say it's staged, because I can't remember the show, but there was always this one quote that it's easier to be a saint in paradise. So when you look at this, it's easier to say like give like all the solutions of how we can fix this because you're in paradise. You're not in that situation, so you can't really say like what you can do.
I understand. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Jessica, you have a comment?
So yes, looking at this picture, I just remember being a migrant mother by Dorothea Lange. So basically, I just feel like he he trying to like make the other people be aware of the situation they are passing through. So I know it's different because she was I think she was commissioned for the government for doing that, but he's doing by his own. I think like is like something similar there, and I think yeah, he probably like want to help them in a um like letting other people know like they are passing through something and probably helping them in some way.
Yeah, a lot of people call that raising awareness, right? So he's using his work to raise awareness of the plight of workers in this case, and then the diamond mines. So yeah, I think that can be a slippery slope, but I think he's on the good side of that idea. He's also just, his own home, which I think is in Brazil, he's sort of like planted 100,000 trees in this area that he lives in, and has done like, he's done more than take pictures. He's actually done environmental change himself. So so this is the work he's been doing in the Arctic about the melting of the ice caps. That, of course, is a very big problem for New York and Florida. As the ocean rises, cities like ours, I live in the Lower East Side, by the way, which is kind of like at 0 sea level. And so, this will be a big problem if the melting, as I should say, as the melting continues. It's not if, it is as. And this is, I think sometimes in one of my classes, I talk about the difference between a news photographer and a documentary photographer. And this is a great example of proper documentary photography, in that he's been going back to this place for over a decade and continues to make pictures year after year after year. Whereas the photojournalist sort of like, oh my God, there's a fire on 57th Street, I'll go take a picture of it, and then never go back there ever again. So his projects are long-term, sometimes over decades in this case, rather than he's just going to fly into some famine-stricken place and take some pictures and leave. This has been an international touring exhibition, by the way. It was in London last time I was there, and there's a book that goes along with it, and it's a gorgeous coffee table-sized book, and all of the proceeds go to some kind of nonprofit organization that's trying to prevent the polar ice caps from melting. A much younger, more contemporary photographer is this guy, Thomas Reed, and we sort of look at this and go, oh, another sort of cold landscape. He actually put those little plastic trees in there. So the scale of this is kind of deceiving in the sense that you might have thought were full live fir trees, but they're really sort of like 3 inches tall and inserted in such a way in the image to make it seem like he's an aerial photographer photographing, the Arctic landscape. But and then he started using model train materials to build miniature sets that look like they're vast, huge landscapes, but are probably 3 or 4 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet deep. And then he finally just gave up actually building the dioramas, and he just started photographing the packages that the trees come in, which is, I think, funny. And you can see how the exhibition ended up looking then. So there's these like 3 by 3 foot prints of plastic trees in their packages. And it's kind of a playful take on the landscape. Laurie Nix is incredible. I'm gonna go fast because she did a lot of these. This is called Accidentally Canvas, this project. She's from Kansas and she came to New York to study, I think she went to SVA for her master's degree. And while she was here, she sort of realized that nobody knows anything about Kansas, her home state, except that when disasters happen, right? When there's a newspaper article or a story on the news about, I don't know, a car runs off the road in the winter and all the inhabitants or all the passengers drown, or a meteor hits a field somewhere, or there's a flood in some small city that none of us would know. And so she began building these miniature dioramas to sort of actually looking at her hometown newspaper and the headlines, drawing from the headlines of her hometown in Kansas, which is like 1,000 people or something, and then making these pictures based on those headlines. And she's moved on since then, but I thought this was really funny. And so she has moved into a kind of like environmental disaster where the train derails, or a hurricane in the background, or you know, all these kind of news stories from Central America that fly, not the countries, but the middle of our country. And oh, the chickens all fell out of the truck. Oh. And a French photographer who does similar things, but his are not about Kansas. They're these kind of idealized miniatures that he makes. He's also a commercial product and fashion photographer, so he sort of does these for fun on the side. All these things are handmade, by the way. So kind of idealized, almost perfect landscapes that he creates because he can make it almost mythically beautiful, right? They look like something out of a fantasy story or a science fiction planet. Or in this case, the Tower of Babel. And so landscape photography sort of, in the case of these past three photographers, went from, so there's a set that he built, right? Sort of seeing behind the scenes. It sort of went from carrying a huge heavy glass and metal camera with glass plates and a tripod and all the chemicals and stuff you needed to develop the picture with you, to working in a studio and creating these kind of idealized landscapes, which are really sort of playing on the I don't know, the tropes, if you will, of landscape photography. And so, right, so, and I'm going to go quickly with Kim Kiever too. Same kind of idea, making these landscapes that seem like some other planet, or maybe while the Earth was still forming and it hadn't quite balanced its atmosphere yet. And it looks like these places are kind of, you know, alien and strange, and again, sort of almost science fiction or prehistory kind of images. And so these are, I always like them. I love the way he uses color and the way he sort of creates these really otherworldly kind of scenes.
How does he add the effects on that?
I'm going to show you in a minute. So I'm trying to like let you just see the pictures first, and then I'll ruin it by showing you how he does it. But the prints are pretty large, by the way. They're like 3 by 5 feet, and it's like 1 meter by 1.5 meters or something. And you know, they're beautiful color prints that are in this kind of large scale, and all the luscious beauty of the color sort of comes out in these lovely prints. All right, so I guess I don't have the image, but he does this all in a fish tank. And so all of those are built inside of a fish tank. And then he has like squirt bottles full of water that he'll sort of squeeze all the squirt bottles, and they'll pump like colored water into the fish tank. And that's how he gets those what look like skies, but obviously they're not skies because they're in a fish tank. So this was a group of photographers, well, mostly one guy who sort of made a project where they purposefully went back to the places that some of those photographs that I showed you at the beginning of the landscape lecture by Timothy O'Sullivan, for example, were made in, and then looked at that place, well, in 1979. This was a project by Mark Klett called the Rephotographic Survey Project, and he used it to teach students. Okay, so this is what, 1867, this one is 1979, and this one is 2000. And you can see the two phonobs, sort of how they've changed, how the salt lake that they're in has kind of, drained a lot. There's not as much water in it. Henry Jackson's Gateway to the Guardian of the Gods, the Garden of the Gods. Again, in 77, it has a road going through it. And now in 97, that road has been closed. And so the idea is they would take students who are learning view camera photography into these locations and have them try to recreate the original image as closely as possible by using the appropriate lens and the appropriate tilts and swings on the view camera and all those other kinds of things. But also, of course, talking about environmental, like how things change over 150 years. And then the third project was called Third View. So Justine Kurland is a photographer who is sort of concerned with mostly women and in the environment, in nature. So she often works with children as well. She's a mother herself. And so we saw, again, early in the in another lecture, we talked about the woman who, Annie Brigman, who sort of went out into the environment and nature nude and photographed herself sort of as a kind of Gaia mythology with that ball, that glass ball. In a way, I think that Kurland is kind of doing a similar thing. Mary Mattingly imagines a future world where people no longer have homes, but they're nomadic. And so everything that they own, everything that they have, they carry with them at all times. She's a really interesting artist who's done a lot of stuff sort of around environmental concerns. This was sort of taking almost like cast off technology and reusing it. She also did a series where she sort of injected corporate symbols into nature. This was kind of half fashion, half photography, and half environmental like stuff. So, it's three halves, but let's just go with that. So this is an example of the one where she was using corporate symbols and putting them into natural environments. Digitally, by the way, it's all Photoshop. So Chris McCaw is someone who uses very long exposures. So this set of 4 pictures was over the whole day. This is one day. And what you see, that black line that you see, is actually the sun doing its arc over the planet. And he leaves the lens cap or the lens open for all that time. And what happens is that the sunlight actually burns into the photographic paper. And so he doesn't put negative material in the camera, he puts photo paper in the camera. I'll be right back. And so the objects are unique, one-of-a-kind things that, there's no negative, and actually the print itself has holes in it and sometimes still has ashes on the those lines where the sun had burnt into the paper. And since they're unique objects, they're one of a kind, they're sort of sought out by collectors because there's not any copies of it. Sugimoto is a Japanese-born but lives in California photographer who's been doing this project for decades now, focusing on a kind of Zen idea of the earth, the sky and water, He actually drew a line across the back of his view camera and would always place the that sort of horizon line in the same place in all the pictures. Whenever he went anywhere that was near water, he would do one of these. And then, so, it's a really simple and subtle idea, and yet when you accumulate them all together, they become something completely else. This is a project he did with opening a shutter of the camera and seeing a whole movie. The shutter's open for 2 hours or however long the movie is. And so in his mind, at least, all the single individual frames of the movie are somehow in the screen. And of course, he chose these beautiful theaters to do the project in. So the way the movie illuminated the space is a big part of it as well. He also photographed dioramas in the Museum of Natural History, and also wax, like wax figurines or figures in like Madame Tussauds. There's one of those, the wax people. And so these are all sort of like fakey, like accurate photographs of fake things, if that makes any sense, right? The real unaltered photographs, and yet they're of things that are created, man-made. Well, these aren't exactly landscapes. I threw them in because Sugimoto does other things than those seascape pictures. This is that kind of idea of the uncanny valley. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that idea, but it's when like models and mannequins and stuff, the more they approach reality, the more they look like human, the weirder things get. And so the uncanny valley is like, oh, that's close to human, that's close to human. And then all of a sudden it's getting, well, that's weird, right? And so when you can't tell if that person is a wax figurine or a human. So that's how the seascapes are exhibited. And so Robert Smithson, of course, is probably best known for Spiral Jetty, but this was a project that they did posthumously from a drawing that he made. There's the drawing in the upper left corner where they built a fake island and then towed it around Manhattan every day. So you could see this kind of, it's a completely artificially made landscape being pulled through the city.
I like the old guy sitting there just unamused.
Yes. And then Bertinsky is another artist, I think, that really is trying to use photography for social change, in particular, the environment. This is from a project called Tailings. And Tailings is basically, he photographs what comes out of a factory. In this case, this is copper, that has just waste copper that has come out of a factory. His first big project was this one where he worked at a quarry. He sort of got lost on the highway somewhere, and I think it's in Canada, and then like found himself in this little area where the quarry is. And he sort of thought it was interesting and yet kind of frightful at how like damaging this industry is to the environment. They're just basically strip mining this mountain for ore. And you can see how much like terrible damage they're doing when they do strip mining like this. So he began photographing that, got interested in the idea of industrial destruction and how our major corporations sort of do this without really any regard to what's happening to the natural environment around them. This was one on places where they cut railroad tracks through mountains. Oops. These pictures also are large scale. They sort of are kind of like the Dusseldorf Academy style photographs. They're big and technically, perfect and impressive. So this is the tailings project where he explores the excess waste produced from mining that goes out into the environment. Some of this stuff is highly toxic, like poisonous stuff, and it's amazing that these companies can get away with doing this, but there's a lot of politics, I'm sure, involved in how they get away with doing this, because it's just horrible to see this stuff. Nickel tailings, right? So that's just the sort of results of converting the ore into nickel, and usually it takes a couple of tons of ore to make a couple of ounces of whatever metal it is that they're converting. Imagine that. That's uranium tailings. So from the factory or the plant that refines uranium, the stuff that comes out of that factory is what you're seeing here. So, in almost all of his projects have something to do with that kind of environmental concerns. This is a quarry in Italy where they mine. No, that actually is still the one in Canada. I'm sorry. That's the one. That's the one in Italy where they mine I don't know, stuff they make tiles out of, and artists use to make sculptures. What is that?
Marble.
Marble. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And the vast scale of these kinds of operations, oil fields in Texas, and the one at the end is this huge project. So when those giant international ships that go from Europe, for example, to America, who carry tons and tons of cars and all these huge ships, I mean, you really, unless you've seen one, you can't really grasp the scale of them. When those are being retired, they all get sent to this one location in India where workers, desperately poor people, basically strip those giant shipping container vessels into their component parts so that they can be melted down and recycled into, more steel or more iron or more, I don't know if it's wire, copper, whatever that may be. And so they essentially, without any kind of masks or any kind of like breathing apparatus, they're burning all this stuff to like shrink it down in scale. And many of these workers end up being, horribly sick from the gases and the fumes that they're breathing as they do this work. But there's really no government regulation or no oversight of the safety of this kind of operation. And so Bertinsky is, really trying to point out these massive environmental problems that are really the source of the destruction of the planet. I mean, we can all turn off our lights and try to not use plastic bottles, but these are the kinds of things that do like 90% of the damage to the environment. Tires have always been a real problem, how to get rid of them. In many cases, these huge tire disposal facilities will catch fire and then will burn for years. It's almost impossible to put a tire fire out. Other kinds of waste materials as well. So that's what happens from breaking up the ships. So he was able to negotiate access to China, which is quite difficult to do. A lot of the Chinese government doesn't want people to see things like this, and he was able to do so. So, these are huge abandoned factories in China, and there was a project where they were going to build a new dam in China, the Three Gorges Dam project. And, you know, I've had students who've described this differently, so I'm not going to try to, this is not that. These are workers in China still. But the pattern, anyways, so yeah. So this is the Three Gorges Dam. When this was, you know, the idea was to generate power, hydroelectric power from the dam, which is very environmentally sound and a good idea. But what happens when you dam a river is that on one side, all of the water levels rise dramatically, and there were thousands of people living on those shores. And so the way he described it was that all of these people were essentially forced out of their homes to build this dam so that the hydroelectric power could be created. It's what I heard also was very different, and is that they were all sort of given a new homes to live in, and they were simply shifted from one place to another. Now that doesn't always make it fine, right? Your home is your home, and you may not want to leave it, even if you get a new one in the city. But there's kind of two sides to that. But essentially what happened was the Three Gorges Dam was made. This is one of the towns that was abandoned. And so all of that is underneath the water now. And there were some final residents who just, you know, refused to leave and lived in these sort of shanty towns. And, but ultimately, of course, water was going to come and cover that. So they really couldn't stay after the dam was finished and the water started going along. All right, so this is, I got a phone call once, and it was from somebody who had bought a house in California, and they were going through the attic, and they found a bunch of glass plate negatives. And the name on the box was O Tower, and they had sort of looked that up, and then they eventually thought that I might be related to this person, and they called me up. They knew I was a photographer. And so I happily accepted this donation of large glass plate negatives. So I ask you all to read that, you know, article about the Frith image that you know, whether the cannonballs were off or on the road. And so apparently he was there as well and made his version of that image, that famous first image of war, so to speak. He was also seemingly hired by the survey, the 49th Parallel Survey Photography Group, to make some of the images in that world, in that sort of project as well. There were some photogravures like this one. We haven't talked about gravures yet, but also at that the Gateway to the Gods location that we just saw in the Third View project a moment ago. That's my dog squeaking, by the way, sorry. And so, you know, he had sort of known a lot of people and been involved in a lot of these projects that I've been showing, and essentially was like my great-great-grandfather. Apparently he had actually studied with Fox Talbot in London, or in England, I mean, and then as a young man sort of moved to the West Coast, to California, and befriended Muybridge and some of the other West Coast landscape photographers. That's him, by the way. He's taken.
Jesus, you look just like him.
Well,
exactly. There's a strong resemblance.
So actually, this is my project. I made all these pictures myself in miniature on the tabletop. I was just messing with you, so to speak. So yeah, that was a fictional identity that I made up called Timothy Eugene Tower, and I made up this backstory, and no comments. Anyways.
Just a second. So did he exist, or have you invented him?
I invented him as a sort of postmodern alternate identity. And I created these using model train materials That tree actually is a rosemary stem that I'd use to cook dinner with. Rosemary goes very nicely with potatoes, if you don't know that. And so that was kind of actually the beginning of the project, is I'd done a potato rosemary thing, and I looked at this stick that I had in my hand, and I was like, that looks like a miniature tree. I can use that. And then proceeded to get rather involved with model train materials, because they were sort of easily available and worked very nicely. And many of these images, by the way, were based on some of the images that you've seen in this lecture. So they had references to specific pictures built into them.
Professor, where's the rock texture coming from?
That's in this case, it's actually just I used a lot of like the things that you use to make a cast, those bandages that when you wet them, they harden, right? So you can shape them pretty easily while they're wet. And then within 24 hours or less, they harden pretty heavily. This
It looks like one of those old props that you find at the one of those sci-fi scenes.
Or even gaming. I got all kinds of other, realized other people do this for different reasons, but this was actually model train rocks that you get a mold and then you cast them and then you paint them and stain them and do things. These are in the foreground. That fence is made of coffee stirrers. The flat wooden ones that don't really stir coffee very well.
Have you shown this as an exhibition?
Yeah, this was a solo show I had in Chelsea, and I don't know, 10 years ago or so.
Oh, so wait a minute. That picture, is that a Photoshop picture of yourself?
It's not Photoshopped. It's a picture of me. But what I did was, I used a view camera for these, and I simply moved the focus nut back and forth while the exposure was happening. So it's kind of both sharp and out of focus at the same time. So, all right, now we've only got like 30 pictures left. All right, so Paul Strand. Strand is kind of right up there with Stieglitz and Steichen. Strand was published in the Camera Work magazine that we talked about a little bit. That was Stieglitz's magazine. This is one of his most famous images. It's a politically inspired picture of sort of nameless, faceless workers going home after a long day's labor. Those 3 black bars or 4 black bars behind them are windows in a huge bank down on Wall Street. It's actually still there, and it looks exactly like this still to this day. It's interesting to sort of see it, that image, and then see it in real life now. But
So you said that those were windows?
Yeah, they're like these huge, they're recessed windows. And so the way the sun is coming sort of almost horizontally, they're just deep in shadow. But yes, they're these big, giant windows.
Yeah, because the way it looks like the building isn't even finished yet. It's just a skeleton.
No, that is finished. It looks exactly like that still. Although there's a kiosk in front that sells sodas and newspapers, but it's finished. And so the political idea of this was that this huge nameless financial institution is dwarfing these tiny anonymous humans that have, they're because they're silhouettes, they're sort of don't have individual identity. They just kind of like work as a symbol for worker. But Strand, he's one of the people who really turned away from this kind of pictorialist style towards a straight photography style very early on. The last issue of Camera Work magazine was actually dedicated to Strand's pictures, and it sort of signaled that change from soft, painterly, kind of moody, dramatic pictures to a more hard-edged, more sort of accurate representation of the world picture. And Stieglitz, sort of after many years of championing pictorialism, sort of realized that this is the future of photography. So Strand, he made a lot of different pictures in a lot of different styles, but ultimately he became one of the more sort of recognized, more famous, if you will, photographers from the early 1920s to the 1940s. A sort of straight style, almost F64, but before F64 existed. Very formalist. I mean, you can really see the influence of modernism with a capital M sort of in his pictures. The way the recurring circles and the bike pictures, in this case, the hats forming these sort of patterns, and the color, at least the tones and the shapes of lines and circles, sort of becoming not quite abstract yet, but moving from pictorial painterly towards the kind of abstraction that we saw earlier. These are some of his better known portraits that he did. This is perhaps his best known image. At that time, if you were a beggar in New York, you actually had to have a license to do it. And so this woman is licensed to beg on the street because she's blind. Sort of later in life, he went to Italy, and I don't know if anybody can not like Italy. It's such an amazing place, but he did this whole series of portraits of the people that live in this little town called Luzara. And the sort of striking, these really striking portraits. But he also worked really, in that issue of camera work. These are some of the pictures from that, where, although it is a photograph of, in this case, actually a chair on its side on a porch, unless it told you that, you probably wouldn't know, and you may not actually see it still. It took me a long time to figure out what I was looking at, but this is definitely the opposite of that bank photograph, where it's hard-edged. It's abstract, and has a sort of emphasis on the kinds of design concepts that we talk about in design 1 classes, like repetition and line and tone and value and so all that sort of stuff. So closing in on in this case probably a Model A Ford or something along those lines, and taking real objects, in this case tulips, and turning them into sort of abstract things, almost along the lines of Georgia O'Keeffe in this case, which he probably would have been aware of because he was friends with Stieglitz, and Stieglitz, of course, was married to O'Keeffe. So but this really, to come back around to what we talked about last week, sort of signals that change from pictorialism to straight photography and moving towards abstraction in the mid 20th century. Okay, so that's the last one.
Okay. Yes. I have a question, because there was it Paul Strand, or there was this photographer who took the pictures of modernist architecture in Palm Springs.
In Palm Springs?
Yeah, where there is a lot of modernist, as you say, in capital M.
Right.
I will search it for next time. Okay.
Okay. I'm not sure if it was him or not. I don't know those images. Oh, I know who you mean. Yeah, it's not him. Okay. I don't remember his name, but yes, he's sort of known for photographing really high modern architecture. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for today. I want to remind you again that this week's visual research exercise is the show at the Met. Let me get it back up here again. I'm on the wrong page, yes. Okay, so here it is, yes. So the Zoom meeting, there's a hand up. Edith, do you have a question? Edith?
Yeah, I was just wondering, where can I know I see that you record the Zoom video lectures, but where can I find them? I was looking for last week's and I couldn't find it.
I haven't actually figured out how to edit them. My Adobe Premiere won't launch. And so I've been trying to figure out how to cut them into smaller pieces because they're like 600 megabytes or more each. So they're not posted yet. However, the lectures are posted as PDFs on this course syllabus website. And so you can download the images only from there. I'll try to get this up this week from the videos of the past lectures.
Okay, it's just I had left a little early last class and I just wanted to see what I missed, but
Well, I understand.
yeah.
So anyways, remember that your visual research exercise is for the Pictures Revisited show at MoMA. This is, of course, we talked about at the beginning, but you know how to do a VRE now, right? You go either physically or virtually and see the exhibition, and then you make or write something about your response to that, that exhibition. In this case, you could pick an individual artist, or you might go ahead and try to sort of look at the whole concept of pictures generation, and rather than focusing on individual artists or pictures.
And when is that due, Professor?
2 weeks from today.
Thank you.
Professor, I have a question about the midterm to make sure that I'm up to date. Is everything about the midterm on the website?
Not really, because I still don't know what I'm going to do, because I normally do an in-class, exam where I show slides and you ID a few, and I think more likely this time around it will be a series of short essays that I will ask, and you'll sort of write about those concepts. As I said, there will be a week before the exam, I will do a review session and emphasize the things that I think you should sort of remember, if you will. And just again, with very few exceptions, except maybe the first photograph and a few other things, I generally don't ask you to date the photographer or anything like that, or tell me the dates of the photographs. And generally the pictures themselves will be the ones that I really emphasize in the lecture. So it shouldn't come as any surprise. I will probably mostly emphasize movements over individual artists. So, how did we move from pictorialism to straight photography? Or how did we, why was portraiture so popular at the invention of the daguerreotype? So it's often, I think, more about ideas than individual artists, with some exceptions, of course, like Daguerre and Fox Talbot.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question, Professor. Is the link for this exhibit on the syllabus?
No, I put it in the chat.
In the chat?
Earlier today.
My connection like cut off. So when it cuts off, I lose like what was previously in the chat. So if you could put it in again, please.
Okay. It's
Just to make sure, this is due on the 25th, right?
that sounds about right. I don't have a calendar in front of me.
Okay, 2 weeks from now.
2 weeks from now, yes.
It's on the chat. I already added it to the chat.
I was just about
Okay, thank you, Vanessa.
All right.
And Professor.
Yes, and Professor, I'm mad because you were messing with our heads. Not cool.
All right. Have a good week, everybody. Try to get outside today. It's such a beautiful day. And I'll see you next week.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
Bye,
thank
Professor
you.
Hall.
Thank you.